So hi everyone, welcome to this session as part of the Research Data Alliance's 10th anniversary series of webinars. Today I'm joined by Michael Witt from the re3data.org and also Purdue University. My name is Matt Cannon. I'm the head of open research for Taylor & Francis based in the UK. And today we've got a few slides to talk you through the work that we've been doing as part of our working group. The title of the session, as you can see on the slides, is about harmonizing descriptions of research data repositories, and this is reporting the work from the RDA Data Repository Attributes Working Group, and I can see that there's some links in the chat if you want to go and find more information. So to quickly lay out what we're going to be talking about over the next 30 or so minutes, we'll give you a bit of background to the problem that our working group is tackling, tell you about the case statement that our group has put together to kind of outline that problem and set out a course of action to try and improve that situation. We've already been working for over a year on this topic, so we can catch you up with the progress that we've been making. Most recently, we had a session at the latest in-person RDA meeting, and so we've got a bit of an update from that meeting. And from then on, Michael will give you a bit of a run through of the documentation, the first draft of the documentation that we produced, and the actions that we still have to complete, and also how you can still get involved with our group and contribute to the work that we're doing. So I hope that all sounds okay. I realise that this session is open to lots of people and not just RDA members. So if you're new to RDA and to our group, then welcome. We're really pleased that you're here and happy to answer any questions that you might have about the RDA and the work that we're doing. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, or you can pop some questions in the chat. We've got plenty of people on here who can help answer any questions you have, and you're very welcome. So I wanted to start by just giving a bit of the landscape and kind of current lay of the land as to why harmonizing descriptions of research data repositories is important. So as you may know, drivers for researchers to share their data that they collect as part of their research activities are increasing. This is coming from funders like the National Institutes of Health and OSTP in the United States, from the Horizon program in the EU and various other funders. It's coming from certain governments. Also, different research institutions are increasingly having policies around what their researchers need to do with their data. Also, when it comes to publishing research, most of the publishers now have some kind of data sharing policy framework, and individual journals will lay out the minimum level of data or activity you need to do in order to publish in those specific publications. Through RDA and various other groups, best practice for handling of research data is that it should be fair. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, but if not, it's an acronym that stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the idea is that the data, or at least the metadata, should be stored in a research data repository. And there are resources to help researchers find the best kind of repository, and there are a couple of well-established repository catalogues, and they can be really useful tools for researchers to use to help find a suitable repository. But there isn't complete coverage. There aren't subject-level repositories for every subject area at the moment, and these catalogues can only surface data that those repositories make readily available in both a human and a machine-readable way. There's also lots of different kinds of research data repositories. I think there's over 3,000 data repositories that are listed in some of these catalogues, and they all have kind of different remits. Some of them are tied to institutions, some of them tied to specific subject areas, some have different regions, and there's also generalist repositories that will just look to hold all different kinds of research data. And this means that many researchers need help in finding the right kind of repository for their data. But this leads us on to the question about what information do repositories actively put out into the public domain about themselves that can really help researchers answer the questions that they have. So this led our group to put together the case statement for our working group. If you don't know the Research Data Alliance has different kinds of groups. So you have interest groups and also working groups. And the working groups have a set structure that runs for 18 months, where you lay out a specific problem and the actions that you're going to take to try and achieve that. So this is on the slide, you can see the statement that we put together for our working group, and lays out what we were going to try and do during the course of our project. And you can see the two main items on the screen there. So firstly, creating a list of common attributes of data repositories with definitions and rationales, trying to assess the feasibility of implementation, and also trying to look and see how widely available some of these things are already. And finally, a selection of examples that really illustrate the current approaches being taken by these different repositories and how we can look to surface all of this different kinds of information that there might be about data repositories. So what have we been doing? So the group, as I mentioned, was established in February 2022 following discussions at previous RDA meetings. We've been having monthly calls with the members of the working group. We've got over 100 members, and 30 of those regularly attend our monthly working meetings where we work collaboratively to solve this problem. We had our kickoff session at plenary number 19, which was last summer, which was mostly virtual or hybrid. And then we had our first mainly in-person session at the latest conference in Gothenburg, Sweden, which was earlier this year in March. And the plan is that we'll be wrapping up this 18-month project after the next RDA meeting, which is in October, I think, plenary 21, and which is combined with International Data Week. And I think that's going to be held in Salzburg this year. One of the things that we did quite early in the project, which has been really useful, was think about some different user stories and how different users of research data repositories might find the work that we're doing particularly useful. You can see the coloured squares, the coloured post-it notes in the top right-hand corner of the screen, but they're really tiny for you to read here. But you can see, and this is only a selection of them, all the different kinds of comments that we had from our group about different potential uses for this work. And I've pulled out a few of them onto the text on the slide so you can see, and they all follow the same format of as a certain kind of role or position, I would like to do a certain thing in order to achieve a certain thing. So for example, as a researcher, I would like to identify a repository in my country in order to share data with my colleagues, for example. And we have a whole range of user stories for different groups involved. So researchers, repository service providers, publishers, research data, repository registries as well. And that's been really useful in thinking about all the different groups and making sure the outputs that we're creating are as rounded and as useful as possible. So next, to talk a little bit about the session that we had in Sweden a couple of months ago. So based on the user stories and the work that we've done, we've created a kind of a first draft list of attributes of research data repositories, and Michael will talk more about those specifically a bit later in the presentation. But the working group had been working quite hard towards the second half of last year and the first few months of this year to get a first draft of this ready. And ahead of the session that we had in person, we shared that draft with three brilliant critical friends, as we referred to them in the session. We shared it in advance, and they each came and gave us a kind of a 10-minute talk, really pulling out the things that they liked about what we'd done, but areas that we could look to improve it. And that was fascinating. They all came from quite different backgrounds with quite different viewpoints on the work that we've done. And Michael will talk more about it, but they've given us a huge and really valuable set of feedback that we'll continue to use as we work through this project. So here's a few pictures so you can see the kind of setup that we had at the in-person meeting. This is part of one of the kind of working elements of the meeting where we divided all the attendees up into specific groups, allocated them one of the stakeholders to embody and think about the work that we've done and how they could improve it. So some groups were asked to pretend to be funders, or publishers, researchers, librarians. Obviously, some people's roles were actually those, and other people had to use their best guess. But yeah, we have a huge list of feedback, and it was a really, really good session. We were really pleased to be able to have a really useful way of involving the online attendees to that meeting as well, because this conference was hybrid. And I think that element worked really well as well. So I think that's all from me, and I'll hand over to Michael at this point.
Great. Next slide, please, Matt. All right, so Matt gave us a terrific kind of setup talking about the genesis of the group and what our case statement is, the problem that we're trying to solve, and some of our methods, over the course of the last year to try to advance this work. I want to highlight that a working group in RDA produces an output. And so there are two different outputs that we want to produce with this working group, which will wrap up in October. The first is a document. We've titled it Common Descriptive Attributes of Research Data Repositories. And like Matt said, this is a list of currently 17 attributes that a repository manager, a service, someone can use to describe a research data repository to make it more findable. And so this will be a document that will be, when we're done, we'll submit this to RDA for endorsement as a recommendation. And then part of that process includes community input and review, and then an actual publishing of the document. So that is output number one of this group, which is a recommendation. Output number two that Matt showed in the case statement is a supporting output. So RDA has a second category of output of things that are, don't necessarily require as rigorous a review or endorsement, but that are really kind of supporting other efforts of the RDA or other recommendations. And so our supporting output, our second output, will be a list of examples of implementations of these attributes by other repositories, not necessarily holding them up as exemplars, but trying to illustrate this is how these things can be used. Okay, so I'm going to spend most of the time here today talking about our primary output, which is our recommendation that we're working on, the common descriptive attributes of research data repositories. And so there's a link here on the slide. Maybe one of my colleagues can drop it into the chat also, so you can see our current version of the work. Understand that we're a working group and this is a working document. So we've already gone through 5 iterations, and we'll probably go through another 3 or 4 or 5 before we conclude our work. So it's definitely not a finished product, and we're very much open to criticism, to input in terms of what's needed, or always open to praise in terms of things you think that are strengths of the document. So be thinking about that in the back of your mind as I'm kind of giving us a quick flyover of the recommendation. So the way we've structured this document, so 17 attributes, and then for each attribute, we have these 6 pieces of information, okay? So the first piece of information about the attribute is the label. And so this is just what we're calling the attribute. And you'd be surprised how slippery this can be. People use different terminologies to express the same concept. And so there's actually a lot of discussion around, what each label should be for the attribute to semantically represent our shared understanding of what that thing is. So that's the first piece of information, is the label for the attribute, what we're calling it. The second one is a description. And this is just meant to be a very pithy 1 or 2 sentence description of, what that attribute is, okay? The third thing is an example, ideally a real world example. So for example, for the attribute repository name, an example would be the Purdue University Research Repository, which is my home institution, or PUR, which is its acronym, because repositories can be referred to by multiple names. The fourth piece of information is the schemata. So does this attribute or does this feature exist in some other metadata schema or some other standard that we can refer to? So there are many different examples for all the different attributes that we found. We just tried to surface 1 or 2, just again to illustrate, what this how this attribute can be expressed in a formal way through a schema. Number 5 is the notes field. So this is basically kind of like our, for lack of a better word, our slush field. So this is where, we tried to elaborate on the attribute in terms of, what are some of the details that kind of complicate our understanding of this attribute. So we had a lot of challenges in terms of what level of granularity we were describing. And so we made the decision that we're describing the data repository level, which is not necessarily descriptive of the data within the repository or collections of data within the repository. So we're operating at the repository level. But even limiting our scope to that, there are a lot of complications in each attribute. So like the repository name, for example, many repositories have more than one name that they go by. And so this notes field is an opportunity for us to kind of encapsulate some of our discussion around, this attribute and its complexities, and share that with the reader. And then sixth is our gap analysis. And this wasn't a very scientific analysis or rigorous analysis. This is really just kind of the sense within our group of how difficult it is to find this information from a data repository. So thinking about repositories in general, for example, the name is typically very easy to find. Other attributes, though, are difficult to find. And some of them are even impossible to find because they're not available or they're buried in some way. Maybe you have to log on before you can see that information, or maybe it is it's like buried deeply in the documentation for the repository, or maybe it's worded in confusing language that a researcher or other stakeholder might not understand. So those are the 6 pieces of information that we have for each attribute: the label, the description, examples, the schemata, notes, and the gap analysis. And like I said, the first draft of the document has 17 attributes. And Matt, if you want to advance to the next slide. All right, what we're going to do here, buckle your seatbelt. I'm going to just kind of do a quick flyover of the current 17 attributes and just talk a little bit about each one, not go into very much depth. You can learn more by joining the group, by reading our document, and we welcome your input. But 17 of these, so I'm just going to kind of go through them like in machine gun fashion, okay? So the first one, repository name. We already used this as an example. This is what the repository calls itself and what users call it. There can be multiple names for the same repository. We recommend that we use the name of the repository that the repository refers to itself as. The name is important because a repository builds a reputation and awareness around its name, and it is what users will commonly search for if they know what repository they want. And we believe this is an easy attribute to find. Okay, so that's number 1, name. Number 2 is the URL. I think most of us know what a URL is. It is the home page and the entry point for the repository on the World Wide Web. We've said that this is the main landing page for the repository. To be clear, most repositories have multiple URLs and multiple points of entry. So it may be confusing in terms of what constitutes the main entry point for the repository. But this information is important because the URL is obviously what most users will use to access the repository and how they'll bookmark it and reference it. And in general, this attribute is easy to find. Number 3, country. We define this as the country in which the repository operates. And of course, we all know it's not as simple as that, right? Many repositories and organizations that run repositories span multiple countries. And so, you may have an entity in one country that manages the data, but it's actually stored on the cloud in another country. And this can be more complicated in terms of like legal jurisdiction and other factors that affect the operation of the repository and who uses it. And so this information is essential for building national repository services and for providing clarity and regulatory compliance for data governance. In general, this information is easy to find, although in some cases it may be quite difficult. All right, number 4 is the language of the repository. And to be clear, this is the language of the user interface of the repository, not of the data or the content of the repository itself. And obviously, this is important because users need to know if the repository presents functionality in a language that they can read and understand. This is also important for enabling national repository infrastructures. And in general, this is an easy one to find. Number 5, institution. So this is the organization that's responsible for the data repository. To be clear, there could be multiple institutions that are responsible for a repository in different capacities, like providing funding, infrastructure, administration, curation, or commercial services. Some users may be required or influenced to use a specific repository because of its institution. So for example, if I belong to a university, I may use my university's institutional repository. Or if I'm funded by a particular agency producing a certain kind of data, I may be required to deposit my data in that repository. And so the institution is important because of its reputation and commitment to data management may influence a user's trust and decision to use a particular data repository. And the institution can sometimes be difficult to find. Number 6 is the contact. So this is basically just the contact information for the repository. Users may need to correspond with the repository to ask questions or to get technical support. Being able to contact a person at a repository is an important starting point for building trust in the repository. And so we say that the contact information, when it exists, is easy to find. But of course, not all repositories provide contact information. Number 7, the description. So this is, like I was saying before, just a general description of the data repository. Users need to understand basic information about the data repository to determine if it's appropriate for them to explore for their use. A robust description can also be indexed and improve the findability of the repository by search engines. And so if you think about it, if you're looking for a repository and you're looking at a list of 3,000 data repositories, it's nice to have kind of like an abstract, you know, kind of like you would read the abstract to decide if you want to read the full paper. Same thing with the data repository. You can look at the description and it'll give you a sense of like, this is the repository for me or not. Our group said this information, the description, is difficult to find. Number 8, research area. This is the subject classification that describes the data sets within the repository. So these would be things like ontologies, subject headings, these kinds of things. And it's important for users to understand the subject matter of the data sets in order to know if the data they're looking for is in that repository. And classification, in particular, using controlled vocabularies, helps to organize the data sets and improve browsing, finding, and interoperability. In general, we find this information is hard to find, what the classification scheme is. All right, deep breath. We're halfway through, just about halfway. Number 9, persistent identifiers. So I think that most people in the research data community know unique, globally resolvable identifiers, things like digital object identifiers and ORCIDs, RORs, and these kinds of things. It is a best practice to use identifiers, and this practice has been reinforced by funding agencies, publisher guidelines, and repository certification. And so stakeholders, users of repositories, may want or need to know that they can get an identifier for their data or for them as an author, et cetera, and get proper credit for sharing their data. In general, repositories make this information easy to find. Number 10, machine interoperability. These are application programming interfaces, or APIs, service endpoints, and other protocol interfaces that enable machine access to a repository. So some of these examples of this would be like metadata harvesting through OAI PMH, file transfer protocol, FTP, Sparkle, SWORD, REST interfaces, OpenDAP, RDFA, basically expressing metadata and exposing data and processes for user agents, for code, and for machines to use. So not a person using a web browser. And so it's important for users to know that they can write code to interact with the repository and what protocols the repository supports. And of course, interoperability is key to furthering the FAIR principles. in terms of machine actionability, like Matt was talking about before. In general, the machine interoperability is difficult to find or to ascertain from a data repository. Number 11, metadata. So these are the formats of the metadata that describe the data sets in a repository. Repositories may support one or more metadata standards, or they may have created their own. And making it clear to the user explicitly how data sets are uniformly described will help them prepare their data for deposit. And it also helps them understand how to better search and explore for data sets in the repository. Structured metadata is also key for indexing and for interoperability. And the metadata schema or schemata can be difficult to find. Number 12, curation. Curatorial services that are performed by the repository, its functionality or its personnel that enhance or otherwise add value to the data and create purposeful collections of data. And of course, we could do a whole series of webinars on curation. It's a very expansive term. Some examples of curation in the context of data repositories that we talked about as a group include enhancing metadata, performing quality assurance, reviewing data sets, selecting and deselecting data, organizing data into collections, reformatting data, creating new points of access, or other activities that improve, enhance, and ensure collected data sets. And so the rationale for this piece of information, for this attribute, is that the users of a repository need to understand what actions may be taken to the data that they deposit and what benefits they get and what value is added by the curation services. We find that this information is very difficult to find or does not exist for many data repositories. Number 13, terms of deposit, policies that explain what data sets the repository will accept for deposit, from whom, and under what conditions. So who can submit data to the repository, what kinds of data will be accepted, are there any restrictions like size, will it cost any money, and what rights the user is granting to the repository. And of course, these are key for someone who's depositing a data set to determine if the repository will accept their data and if it will cost them anything. And this is difficult to find. So that's depositing data. In terms of who can access the data, we have terms of access. So these are policies for who can view and access a data set and under what conditions. So are the data openly available? Can depositors limit access to the data? Are data sets embargoed? Does the repository require registration, or do they charge a fee for accessing data? And then, of course, it's important to know that different data sets and different data collections within the repository may have different terms of access, okay? And so users who need to comply with open access mandates need to understand if the repository fulfills those mandates or not. So it's an important attribute, which can be difficult to find by many data repositories. Okay, almost done. Number 15 is the data set use license. So there's accessing the data, and then there's downloading it. What can I do with the data? So that's what the terms of reuse comprise. Here, things like Creative Commons, GNU, et cetera. We recommend that the licenses are clearly exposed and explained to users, but that they're also machine actionable. So having links to the licenses that are being used. And then, of course, users need to understand what they can do with data that they download. And users who may submit data for deposit need to know what license options will be available to them before they go through the work of depositing their data. And this is difficult to find in most data repositories. Number 16 is certification. So this is earning a certification, typically by means of a third-party audit that presents evidence that a repository meets some formal standard or adheres to a set of best professional practices. So an example of this could be like Core Trust Seal. And the rationale is that funders or publishers may require deposit of data in a certified repository. Certifications also help users build trust and to better understand the repository's commitment to stewarding their data. And the gap analysis here is that certifications are very difficult to find, or in many cases just don't exist because the repositories aren't certified yet. And then last but not least, in number 17, we have preservation policy. So these explain the repository's commitment and processes that ensure the long-term preservation, fitness, and availability of data sets. So examples would be like a digital preservation strategic plan, file format recommendations, preservation support policies, deaccession and transition policies, as well as what tools and platforms are used for preservation. And of course, it's important for a user to understand this because they want to know, what's the commitment to preservation and how will it be done by this repository? Will the repository be a good long-term steward for my data? And then the gap analysis here is that preservation policies are still nascent with many data repositories. They can be difficult to find, or in many cases don't exist. So that was the flyover. Thank you for bearing through that, all 17 of our attributes. Hopefully it gives you an idea of what we're conveying in this document, and you can be thinking about, what's missing that should be in here. What should the 18th or 19th attribute be that is important and is shared across data repositories. Next slide, please, Matt. So if you are part of a stakeholder group or you otherwise care about data repositories, if you're a researcher, if you're a research infrastructure provider or a service provider, if you're a librarian, if you're a publisher, if you're a funder who are engaged in research and data management and using data repositories, and this work is interesting to you, we invite you to join us. So join the RDA. We're over 13,000 people around the world who care about research data. And then once you join the RDA, it's free to do. You just go to the website and click the link and give some information. You sign up and create an account. You can go to the webpage for our working group and see some more information about it. You can join our working group, which is essentially a mailing list, and then you'll get an invite to our monthly meetings. And I just want to say it's not too late to join. Even though we've done a lot of work in the last year to get to this point, it's going to be a sprint to the finish between now and October. We've got 5 months to wrap this up, and we could really use your help and your input to produce the best possible recommendation. So join. Matt, next slide, please. So if you join us now, what is the work that we're going to be doing over the next 5 months? So like Matt said, we meet the third Thursday of every month. So if you join the working group, you'll get the invitation link. At our session at the 20th plenary in Sweden, we engaged different stakeholders and had our critical friends, and we generated over 50 suggestions for our document. So we're currently, as a group, about halfway through processing all of those suggestions and deciding what to incorporate, how to incorporate it, et cetera. And that's important work. In the very near term future, we'll be finalizing a release draft of the document and submitting as an RDA recommendation. And then we'll be beginning the supporting output, which is another document which illustrates different example implementations of the data repository attributes. The RDA process then incorporates a period of time for community input and review. And so we'll do that. Our hope is to have these endorsed by the RDA. And then like all working groups, we have a plan for promoting, adopting, and implementing them. So there's still an opportunity to get involved and to make a meaningful contribution. Next slide, please. I want to acknowledge colleagues. So we're really fortunate to have 6 co-chairs from this group from different parts of the world and from different stakeholder communities. So besides Matt and I want to acknowledge Allison Lister, Washington Segundo, Kathleen Shearer, and Kazu Yamaji, as well as our technical advisory board liaison, Rosella Aversa, as well as our what are now 116 working group members. We really are a working group. We actually don't give very many presentations. Most of our group meetings we have an agenda, we have a work package, we roll up our sleeves, we go into breakout groups, we come back together, and we've been getting stuff done. It's been really a terrific process and a really good group. So next slide, please. We end here again with the join us slide. So we hope that if this has been interesting to you, that you'll join the RDA and that you'll join our group and join our effort. And so thank you all for your time. We've got a little bit of time now. If there are any comments or questions, please jump in. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael, especially for the marathon description of all the 17 repositories. I'll let you catch your breath there. So yeah, I think, Alexandra, have you got a question?
Hi. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. So I'm Alexandra Kokinaki. I work in the British Oceanographic Data Center. I'm also co-chairing the Vocabulary Semantic Services Interest Group in RDA. So my question is, are you planning to also have machine actionable information out of these properties?
Yes.
Yes, so you are planning to align that with like schema.org because there is already, so I don't, you probably have looked at into that. So ESIP Science on schema.org have an RDA, sorry, have an data repository description in schema.org terms, properties.
So let me jump in here. So the recommendation that we have is we stop short of an implementation. Okay, so the 17 attributes are not, they could be implemented in schema.org. They could be implemented in other ways. So that's why we intend to provide example implementations. So one of the example implementations will definitely be schema.org. Yes, and if we'd welcome help with that.
Okay, yeah, because the cat also has some, and I'm currently working on something similar, but for digital twins. So it would be nice to align efforts and be interoperable as much as possible.
Oh, definitely. Yes, let's please connect after the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great points. Have we got any other questions or other points that people would like to make? I don't think there's anything else in the chat, is there, Connie?
No, not at the moment.
Sorry, just one more. Yeah.
Oh,
if
sure.
you,
Yeah, no, I wasn't sure whether your hand was still up from
I raised
before or
it
whether
again.
you had it.
Yeah. So if you like, in case you don't, so several ontologies and schemas out there may have the properties, but you may not find some of the properties that you have. Are you planning to extend an existing ontology, or if you need to, how are you going to add something in? Maybe you could extend schema.org and ask for like an additional property or DCAT.
So that's a great question. Thank you for that. So it would be outside of the scope of this group to do that within our 18 months, but that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to be able to enable. So, part of the adoption and implementation of this, I think, is going to be, different stakeholder groups, kind of like repository managers, for example, could take this list of attributes back and ask themselves, am I providing all of this important information to my users, through the web, site, and also, through, machine actionable interfaces. Taking the attributes and crosswalking them to other schemata may inform, future versions or improvements on other schemata as well. So, like, for example, from my perspective, from re3data.org, we're a registry of research data repositories, and we're getting ready to put out the 4th version of our schema. And, we're looking forward to this output to be able to inform the next version of our schema and how we, index data repositories in it. And so we hope to be able to enable the kind of work you're talking about, but to be clear that that kind of implementation is outside of our scope and what we can accomplish in the next 5 months.
Okay, thank you.
Charles.
Hi, so I'm Charles Woodford. I am one of the co-chairs for the Global Open Research Commons Working Group. We're working on a model that seems to have quite a bit of overlap with what you guys are doing too. And ironically, we're also looking to finish in October of this year. So it would be really, really great, similar to what Alexandra said, to look at alignment and see where we can maybe complement each other's work instead of redoing work. I'm going to be probably signing up to join your working group just to ensure that. But really, really great work. And I just wanted to say that your model of working and how you have things lined up with the attributes is really interesting and really valuable.
Thanks for that, Charles. That's one of the tremendous values of RDA, is to help us, keep us from reinventing the wheel. And there's always a process of like kind of, people may go off in a decentralized way and pursue the same solutions to the same problem, taking different approaches, but then having a venue to be able to come back and bring them together again. And if we're hopefully crossing the finish line in October at the same time with both of our groups, let's definitely sync up. That's great. Thank you.
We have a couple of comments. Well, a comment from Lindsay Anderson: crosswalks would be an interesting follow-on to this work. And also we have a question from Jonathan Petters. I don't know if Jonathan, maybe you want to unmute and ask it yourself, or I can ask it for you. I don't mind.
I can do so. Thanks, Connie. Yeah. Hey guys, I was just wondering if there's any interest. I mean, I understand this. You're just making the attributes. The scope of this is just creating the attributes, kind of the finish of that. But any ideas of incorporating these attributes into repository indices like RE3 data, like fair sharing? Has that been a topic of discussion? Is there any interest in those groups to do such a thing? Because that would be really great.
Allison, jump in to agree.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Michael already said about RE3 data. As the content and community coordinator for fair sharing, I can reassure you that these attributes will also be incorporated into the metadata fields for our database records in fair sharing. There you are. Let me know if you have any other questions though.
Yeah, so that's kind of baked into the design of our working group, is to have some implementers as co-chairs, and hopefully we've been able to engage more through our meetings and through the plenaries and outreach like this webinar. Do we have any other questions, Connie?
We have no more in the chat.
Well, this seems like a good time to wrap up then. Thanks everybody for joining us. And again, we are interested in your input and participation, and there's still plenty of time and still important work to do. So if you're interested, join RDA, join the working group. Otherwise, have a fantastic day. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Cheers.
Bye.